Special education has expanded and grown substantially to encompass the needs of all students. While the areas of LD and EBD have been defined, there are still disproportionate representations. Today, we will talk about these, including the legal issues surrounding current legislation and implication for today's special educators. Disproportionate representation of students with a learning disability, or LD, occurs when students are either under-identified or over-identified in special education. Certain minority groups who are at risk to be identified as LD include African Americans, Hispanic, and Native American students, according to Lisa Thompson Sousa. Currently, the trend is for females to be underrepresented, while males are overrepresented. Research from the National Research Center on Learning Disabilities says that African Americans are almost 3 times more likely to be identified as LD than their Caucasian peers. Some contributors to the disproportionality of these students include the pre-referral, assessment, and placement stages. Unfortunately, teacher referral is a strong predictor of eligibility of LD services. Students with an emotional behavioral disorder, or EBD, are generally underrepresented in special education. EBD is defined not by the type of behavior, rather to the degree in which the student exhibits the behavior and length of time it lasts. Male African American students are at higher risk for being identified as EBD. Students identified as EBD tend to be segregated from their peers due to adult responses to their behaviors. There are legal issues relating to disproportionate representation of special education students. Special education was born out of the civil rights movement, and those advocates whose efforts resulted in the first national special education legislation emerged from those struggles of the civil rights movement. Legal suits and research have proved that disproportionate representation of special education students remains very prevalent in the education community. The IDEA Act of 1997 stressed the importance of efforts to prevent mislabeling and dropout rates of minority students with disabilities. In current legislation, Lowson and Weiner say, in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education and legislative action to provide equal access to education, institutional structures such as ability grouping and significantly separate special education classrooms continue to keep minority students segregated from their white peers. There were continued challenges that were brought in court under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, addressing the role of standardized testing and the reduced educational opportunity afforded by the racial isolation of minorities in special education programs. Finally, under the provisions of the IDEA Act in 2004, states must monitor disproportionate representation by race or ethnicity in disability categories and special education placements and require the review of local policies, practices, and procedures when disproportionate representation is. There are implications for special educators. One of the most consistent findings in educational research is that students achieve in direct proportion to their opportunity to learn, according to Wang, Hartel, and Wahlberg. It might well be expected that students whose educational opportunities are limited will be more likely to be referred for special education services. Kozel says, differential access to educational resources has been consistently demonstrated for some minority groups in a number of areas. So, teachers need to be aware of special needs and set realistic expectations and goals for those students. Teachers should not set limits to those who have been identified as special ed and give them the opportunity to learn.